We're already living in a dystopia. We've got a tiny number of Mark Zuckerbergs and Elon Musks.
Where has socialism ever successfully dispersed power?
It has not.
If Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, what would you like him to do straight away?
There would be some room for private ownership.
I don't think the state's overboard, no.
And I would say capitalism's responsible for this huge elevation. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you want money, you have to have a central bank.
No, you don't. Hello and welcome to another episode of Room for Thought. Now, you may have noticed in recent years, throughout the Western world, an extraordinary phenomenon is starting to happen. I'm not talking about the outbreak of populism. I'm talking about something that I think may be even more politically significant. This is the rise of what you might call the New Left. Old ideas, or perhaps new ideas, that we find on the radical left in Britain, Europe and America, are making a strong comeback. In America, we see the rise of Bernie Sanders and AOC. Over here, Jeremy Corbyn came within 4,000 votes of becoming Prime Minister at the last election. Now, today I want to talk to one of the leading lights behind many of the new ideas on the New Left. Grace Blakeley, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've written a book.
I have. It is right here.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah,
and what's the basic hypothesis?
Absolutely. So it's called Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialization, available in all good bookstores. And it will be out on the 10th of September.
Fantastic.
And the central premise of the book is that we've been living, effectively, as many people will know, since the financial crisis during a period of relative economic stagnation that's manifested itself in a number of different ways, whether that's a decade of wage stagnation, falling productivity, falling living standards, rising poverty, etc. And economists are kind of at a bit of a loss to explain what's going on there. And so the central argument of the book is that what happened in 2008 was the collapse of an entire economic model, which I call finance-led growth, that was kind of initiated in the 1980s and grew and grew and grew, obviously becoming I suppose, well, you had ever higher levels of debt, you had the rising size of the finance sector, you had huge amounts of economic and financial integration into the global economy. And that model ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions in 2008. And the period that we've been in since then, that kind of 10 years since the crisis, is that quite furtive moment between the death of the old and the birth of something new. And this, for me, is why we've been experiencing, as you mentioned, the kind of the rise of the New Left alongside all sorts of other political upheavals. It's essentially because people are looking around for the next model, for the next system, according to which, you know, the economy is going to work, because the old one is now dead.
I mean, I certainly agree with you that excess creation of money and excess creation of credit has had some pretty bad symptoms. I mean, you talked about the productivity puzzle. I've yet to meet a mainstream free market economist who's got a good explanation for the productivity puzzle. But I would also agree that excess creation of credit has had all sorts of secondary consequences. I think it's one of the reasons why, as a country, we import more than we export. It's one of the reasons why we overconsume. Cheap credit means people can splurge. But talk me through, what do you think some of the other consequences are? Do you think inequality is a consequence of this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the way that I understand this process of what I call financialization, which is the process according to which this model of finance-led growth develops, is that it's not just about kind of rising banks, the creation of excess credit, as you say. It's actually how the logic of finance comes to impose itself upon all areas of economic activity.
Right.
So the way that the book works is that I start by looking at the emergence of this model. So look at the crisis of the 1970s, how that period of kind of conflict and confrontation paved the way for the emergence of new ideas. And you did have that on the right and the left at the time. Obviously, the right, in the end, won out. But I would argue that should be seen as a battle rather than, necessarily a kind of a victory of ideas. It was very much a victory of kind of in terms of politics. And so what emerged from that system was obviously this logic of finance-led growth. And that impacted every area of the economy, essentially. If you take Keynes's demand function, which is consumption by households, investment by businesses, government spending, and net exports, financialization has impacted all of those things. So firstly, you've had the financialization of corporations. And this has manifested itself in...
So they borrow huge amounts of money and take over other companies and operate so-called leveraged growth?
Well, yes, that's part of it, definitely. So you definitely had in the 1980s the rise of the kind of corporate raider and the activist investor who would load up on cheap debt, go in and buy up a load of equities in a company, and then use that power to disgorge lots of money that could go to creditors and shareholders. But that's really part of a much broader logic, which is this idea of shareholder value maximization. So rather than kind of seeing their role as maybe specializing in the production of a particular good or service, businesses today are much more focused on their standing in the city, in Wall Street, their share price, how much they're dishing out to shareholders. And as a result, you've seen a fall in productive investment, a fall in wage growth, and a significant increase in dividends payouts, in mergers and acquisitions activity. A very concentrated form of capitalism at the moment as a result of a huge amount of mergers and acquisitions.
One of your central arguments is that cheap credit has acted in the interests of certain vested interests, and that cheap credit has allowed big corporate entities, big banks to accumulate wealth rather easily with a sort of one-way bet. Surely the biggest vested interest is the state. The British state likes cheap credit. And one of the reasons why so-called financialisation, this proliferation of easy money, is because actually governments like to overspend. They like to borrow.
Well, I would agree that the state is a vested interest. I would not say that has resulted in an over-borrowing. What I actually think is that...
You don't think the state's over-borrowed?
I don't think the state's over-borrowed. No, not considering the kind of crisis into which we were plunged in 2008. If you look at borrowing prior to the crisis, 40% of GDP, right? And the ideology that was kind of came alongside the rise of finance-led growth in the UK impacted the state as well. And actually what we saw was that rather than borrowing to spend, as states traditionally have, they were increasingly outsourcing that spending, not just outsourcing the services, but outsourcing the actual spending to private interests. So you had the rise of private financing initiatives, which actually cost the government more in terms of borrowing than it would have if they'd just borrowed the money themselves on capital markets.
Isn't this a symbiotic relationship between big banks and big government? Both of them like to have an arrangement where basically the government can get money either through PFI or the bond market to spend today, and in return for that it sort of writes out a whole bunch of IOUs, either a PFI contract with all sorts of punitive clauses in it, or bonds, a guaranteed slice of future tax revenue. Isn't the problem a symbiotic relationship between big government and big banks rather than the free market?
The problem is a symbiotic relationship between big government and big banks, but that has an integral relationship to how the free market ends up emerging and how it works. Ultimately, the way capitalism functions today is reliant upon the state. You could not have allegedly free markets without the state willing to enforce certain kinds of property, certain kinds of market relations, without regulation, without control over borders.
You might say.
Well, I mean, exactly. This is an interesting argument. I mean, I would say that the utopian ideal of free market capitalism is in fact an impossibility, right? And that's because capitalism has an inherent tendency towards concentration and towards what you might call kind of corruption and vested interests, etc. Exactly, because you get an ever smaller number of people controlling an ever increasing amount of stuff. Those people naturally end up having links with the state, and they therefore come to kind of subvert democracy and use the state in order to further their interests. Now, for me, the best way to, this isn't an inherent part of the way the state has to function. For me, what is the most important thing about actually moving towards a socialist system, aside from obviously, making sure that we have different models of ownership so that tiny number of people doesn't own all the stuff, is actually introducing the logic of political democracy into the way that the economy works.
So would socialism disperse power?
I would say it would, yes.
How would
it
it do
further
that?
and deepen political democracy to make sure that the people who run the state, the people who run, the quangos, all kind of areas of state activity and of government activity are directly accountable to people, to the voters, as well as to various different stakeholders, and are accountable in terms of how they, manage their relationships with the private sector, in terms of their environmental impact, in terms of all sorts of outcomes, not just, whether or not they've increased the size of the economy, but how equal we are, etc. And you would also apply that logic of kind of very strong direct accountability to how the economy works.
So you believe that capitalism is inherently, ends up, as Piketty argues in his book, concentrates economic power you get cronyism and a concentration of political power. You think socialism would disperse power.
I do think that first point of what you just said is true. It actually dates back to Lenin over 100 years ago, who talked about monopoly capitalism. And before him,
How did that work out?
Well, I mean, his theory, of course, putting aside any political results that came out from that, his theory was that as capitalism develops, there is a tendency for a smaller number of people to control more of the stuff, and that as a result, you get stronger relationships between the small number of people who own those companies and the finance sector, because the banks are very involved in providing credit for the mergers and acquisitions that underlie that, for the kind of capital investment that underlies that, and that therefore you end up with this kind of financialized model. And in many ways, they were a bit early with that, because of course there were indications of that in the run-up to the Wall Street crash. But really, today we're at the peak of kind of financial capitalism.
I definitely agree with you. That I think there's a real problem with, I'm not going to label it, the economic system we have today.
Yeah.
I think it does what you call financialization. The free market Austrian economist in me would say, yeah, absolutely. There's a fundamentally rotten system here. But I just want to tease this out a little bit. I mean, when you look at financialization, surely it's an absence of the free market. Take, for example, interest rates. Central bankers set interest rates. This is the price of credit being set by a state institution. That's not the free market. QE is a subsidy, a bailout, ultimately paid by the rest of us, to big banks. That's not the free market. Surely it's a sort of crony corporatism that's the root cause of the problem.
Well, I would agree with you, but again, I don't think it's possible
We like
to
common
have...
ground on this show.
I don't think it's possible to have free market capitalism without that system eventually emerging. Because, as soon as you get private ownership, supported by the state with the aim of profit, that system has an inherent tendency towards concentration. And I think the most important thing about the two examples you just gave, which are interest rates and quantitative easing, is actually the nature of money. Now, this is probably the most fascinating thing about modern capitalism is how money works. And essentially, we've moved away from a system of commodity money, which was also backed up by the state and supported by tax revenues, towards a system of central bank and credit money. And essentially, the money that we have in our pockets is a form of IOU backed up by the power of the state. The state issues money without anything to kind of go off. And then the strength of that money, the value of that money, is based on our trust in the state to be able to pay that back over the long time.
It's a pound, in effect.
Yes, exactly. We trust the fact that we have a strong state which has the capacity to raise taxes, and therefore the English pound is relatively strong. At the moment, we're seeing the strength of that pound decline somewhat, perhaps because international investors don't think that over the long run, that state will remain as strong. But ultimately, it is the trust of people that underlies the value of our currency. And that is something, it's another indication that you couldn't have capitalism without the state.
I'm really fascinated. In your book, when do you argue that this corruption of the system, this financialization began? Is the 1980s, you said?
I think the 1980s was the beginning of entirely new institutional apparatus. But I think it starts almost immediately after the Second World War, when you have a completely different form of political economy, the kind of Keynesian or post-war consensus, where you had effectively a kind of tripartite relationship between unions, businesses, and the state.
When the state begins to intervene in the economy.
Well, the state intervenes much more. I mean, obviously, the intervention starts earlier when you have the Second World War. But
linking that point with the point about the change of the nature of money, surely the really big, significant, and often overlooked change of the nature of money was 1971.
Yes.
1971, end of Bretton Woods. Now, this is taught as being, Nixon needing to finance the Vietnam War. Actually, there's a real significance here. That's the moment when the dollar, and by extension all the other countries' currencies that were pegged to it, the dollar is decoupled from the value of gold.
Yeah.
That's when you have a combination of fiat money, unrestrained fractional reserve banking, and in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and today, we're dealing with the consequences of that. You can't have paper promises issued by banks and an unrestrained appetite to spend money by government. It doesn't work.
So 1971 was significant for two reasons. Firstly, obviously, you did have the collapse of Bretton Woods. So you're right, we moved towards a system of entirely fiat money where currency is issued based on a kind of promise to pay.
Followed by chronic inflation.
Well, yes, okay, followed by... so in the UK, you obviously have that, and you have it alongside it. something called competition and credit control, which is introduced by the Bank of England. And that removes entirely, or not entirely, but to a great extent, quantitative restrictions on the ability of private banks to create money.
Yeah.
So you have a combination of a move towards fiat money and the removal of credit controls.
And it's really important at this point because once you've got 100% fiat currency and private banks can create money at will, suddenly you've got to impose credit controls because the consequence is that, guess what happens?
Exactly, and I kind of outline in the book why this change is so significant because neoclassical economists would say, this doesn't really matter. There was this idea they would say this idea of monetarism, right? So it doesn't. You shouldn't have quantitative restrictions on the capacity of private banks to lend. What you need to do is use the interest rate to control lending. And if you make credit expensive enough, then people won't use it to invest in these ways.
I used to have arguments with Tory MPs who would say they believe in the free market, and then in the next sentence say they believe in monetarism. And I would say, hang on, if you believe in the free market, how can you believe in the state controlling?
Well, they would argue that they were trying to set the interest rate, which will be the price of money, at a level commensurate with supply and demand. They thought they'd found a way to do that.
Imagine if those same politicians were to say, we're going to control the price of bread to make sure there's enough bread in London. I mean, we're going to control rents. People on the centre-right ought to know that that doesn't fit with a free market philosophy. Yet somehow when it comes to money and banking, Tory MPs and thinkers just abandon any pretense in believing in the free market, and they're suddenly in favour of central bankers deciding things.
Well, I mean, it's a similar sort of thing of how many on the right view unions, for example. So there's supposed to be a kind of inherent bias towards people being able to to be free to kind of undertake the things they want. Exactly, come together in communities and in
unless
workplaces,
they demand higher wages.
Unless they're unions, because unions are allegedly interfering with the price mechanism. Mm-hmm. There is this kind of weird, I suppose, almost mystical idea of what the price mechanism is in neoclassical economics. There is this idea, it's almost Platonic, right? Mm-hmm. There is an ideal price that is somewhere out there in the world, that sometimes what happens in the real world means that we don't quite meet that price. Mm-hmm. So whether it's unions getting in the way, or whether it's, central bankers setting the wrong interest rates, which would give you the kind of, the ultimate price of money. And so they think, right, that's the point at which the state is able to intervene in order to, get us to that true price. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's ridiculous because a lot of these things, in most markets, and particularly in labour markets and money markets, the price is not an objective thing. It is representative of a social relation, and it has to do with power, right? So when it comes to labour markets, the price of wage labour is determined by structural factors in the rest of the economy, whether that's, the size of the labour market, the number of corporations, how monopolistic they are, as well as the relative power of those two groups in society, the relative class power of those two groups. When it comes to money markets, what determines, the interest rate is obviously, the power of the central bank relative to other central banks.
I would say it's a bunch of cronies and flunkies who've worked for big corporate banks who get appointed to the central bank to rig the market in.
Exactly, and in doing so, they then often give favours to the private banks, whose power also is what determines.
It's not just a symbiotic relationship; it's a parasitic relationship.
Well, I mean, that is one way of looking at it. I think the private banking system as well. It's not just the central banks that are setting interest rates. It's also these private banks that are not passing on the rate that they're giving to consumers. Often consumers with certain forms of unsecured debt are paying many, many multiples of the interest rate that's set by central banks.
That's where the bonuses come from.
Well, exactly. So there's then a question, right, as to what you do about this. On the one hand, there are some people who say, right, this is not free market enough. I would imagine that would be your view. We need to kind of try and strip out the cronyism, try and, make these institutions more competitive, more in line with free market principles. What I would say is that there's no such thing, whether in abstraction or in reality, as a free market. Any market is constructed and it emerges in the context of certain power relations. Mm-hmm. The state is obviously, the most powerful in terms of violence entity in any society, and therefore has a kind of monopoly almost on being able to set some of these rules. But the way they play out is determined by power relations. So we need to shift power relations.
I think you're absolutely right to say there's no free market utopia anywhere in the world. Even countries that I admire, Hong Kong, Switzerland, they have state intervention.
Hong Kong's great because mass state ownership of land.
Well, you may say that. Subject for another day. But You talked about a socialist country, a socialist model in which power would be dispersed. Where's this ever happened? Where has socialism ever successfully dispersed power?
It has not. Right. And this is another kind of central argument in my book, is that we have had examples of state socialism, obviously, throughout the years. Whether you look at, very extreme examples of totalitarian and repressive regimes in the USSR,
or moderate ones like Venezuela.
Or whether you look at, Venezuela is an arguable case, but even the UK in the post-war period, right, was like moving towards an ideal of what a socialist state might look like, a state socialist state might look like. You had relatively high levels of state ownership, you had quite strong unions, you had a lot of kind of services that were decommodified, that were free at the point of use. But that ended up, basically failing as a result of some of the contradictions of that model. And I would argue it's because we've never had democratic socialism. We've had consistently all over the world state socialism.
What's democratic socialism? How's it going to work this time?
So the argument being that the only way in which accountability ever works, the only way in which you prevent the emergence of these crony relationships, these vested interests, basically the only way to kind of put a halt on the concentration of power in the hands of a tiny elite is very strong and rigorous mechanisms of democratic accountability. Not just in politics, but in the economy too.
This is why I came out in favour of direct democracy, and I, as a member of parliament, wrote books about it. I completely agree. You need to make people who decide public policy much more accountable to the public than they are. But how is socialism going to do that? Surely you need liberal democracy.
So, on the one hand, you have obviously political democracy, but that doesn't go far enough, because the vast majority of time that people spend in their lives, they spend in their workplaces, working, consuming, doing, effectively engaging in economic activity. When that is anti-democratic, it translates into the political sphere. When you have too great concentrations of economic power, that translates into crony capitalism. What we need is a system of economic democracy, which combines different forms of ownership. So, for example, consumer ownership of utilities, community ownership of public services, worker ownership of corporations, with direct democracy within firms.
Okay. But say, for example, you democratised a firm according to the democratic socialism. Would you allow the people who worked for the company to run it?
Yes, why not? There are examples all around the world where you see greater worker participation in the governance of corporations. It massively increases productivity. This was, in a kind of, in a weird way, the secret to the Japanese success. They started to get workers more involved on the production line and saying, this is what's going on here, we need to shift some of this stuff, because they were at the grassroots, at the ground level, noticing problems as they emerged. Firms are really, and this is another thing.
But they didn't give them ownership. They may have allowed.
They didn't give them ownership.
They may have allowed local initiative. I mean, any large organisation that allows local initiative, whether it's an army or a big corporation, is more productive.
Exactly.
But they never gave them ownership.
Because, well, of course, because ultimately you can decentralise, but you want
and in
to
fact,
maintain the power.
Japan's got a huge concentration of economic power.
Yes.
The Zaibatsu, some would say the Zaibatsu were directly responsible for the militarization and
Exactly, and I'm not saying Japanese capitalism is a good thing. I'm just citing that as an example of how decentralization and the concentration of power...
Give me an example where this sort of corporatist model has worked.
Of where the corporatist model...
Corporatism.
I don't believe in corporatism.
Okay.
I think we need, effectively, worker engagement and ownership with a stakeholder model of corporate governance. Okay. So if you had a firm that was owned and run by the people that worked in it, alongside representatives, alongside representatives of the...
If it's such a good model, why haven't cooperatives, why wasn't Facebook a cooperative? Why wasn't Samsung a cooperative?
Again, it comes down to the question of power. There are models where, for example, Uber is a natural kind of model for being a cooperative.
So why doesn't someone just set one up then?
Because
if it's such a good model, defeat Uber.
The people who have all the power, the people who control that market,
well, it's the consumers,
would not allow that to happen.
But surely it's the people with mobile phones who have the power.
A big part of the reason why you obviously don't have much larger worker ownership, why you don't have much more kind of community ownership, why you don't have different models of ownership, is because of the way that capitalism has developed. It is based on private ownership by a small number of people, and obviously as those people have become more powerful, they've been able to control more things. Financialization has helped that. Those people have been able to take out debt to buy up larger portions of the economy. They've been able to use our savings to buy up big stakes in corporations and force them to behave in a certain way, which is actually to maximize profits. often regardless of whether that is efficient for the economy as a whole, for the environment, for whether or not it meets a whole load of other issues that we would like to take into account when we were building a good society.
Didn't East Germany try this model of worker-owned cooperatives and worker-led cooperatives?
There have been examples where worker-owned cooperatives have been a much more significant part of the economy, right? So, for example, Yugoslavia is one of those. And again, there have always been problems scaling that model up.
What was the problem in Yugoslavia?
So in Yugoslavia, you had lots of different worker-owned cooperatives in different parts of the country. And one argument as to why the tensions that emerged in the run-up to the war got so bad was that you had different levels of productivity in different regions of the country. And there was therefore the need to kind of redistribute from one place to another, which created problems.
So democratic socialism was so successful it created regional inequalities which resulted in war. Again,
this is not, I would argue, the kind of perfect model that we would be looking at, because it would be, what you would need to do would be combine different models of ownership. So worker-owned corporations, cooperatives is one model. Community-owned enterprises is another model, for example. And you would need some state ownership of things that were natural monopolies, but with rigorous democratic accountability.
I mean, I certainly think that any functioning free market economy, whether it's the Venetian Republic or the UK today, you've got to allow capital and risk to be managed. And in order to do that, the state confers upon companies. In the Venetian Republic, they were commender contracts. Today, we call them joint stock companies. The state confers the privilege of limited liability. And I certainly think it's possible today to say that publicly listed companies, in return for having limited liability, have certain obligations, and you can change the nature of those obligations. So I think the whole issue of corporate governance reform is ripe for being reviewed, and I think the digital economy necessitates that. But I think there's a slight danger if you start to say that the model has got to be worker-owned cooperatives. I think that's where you lose a lot of...
Again, one of several models of the different models of ownership of the economy, right? So, I mean, you can imagine a society in which you had state ownership of railways, utilities, etc., a lot of
so you'd like to see the state
local cooperatives
take back control?
I would like to see the state, definitely own
what about airlines?
Monopolies that as long as they were subject to rigorous democratic accountability, there would be some room for private ownership, right? The question is not one of constructing a perfect model. The question is one of power. And again, I come back to your example of what we can do with publicly listed companies to make them work better in terms of corporate governance. And that is why we need to think of a completely different kind of model. Because as long as you have economic power concentrated, you have political power concentrated. And those two things end up being symbiotically interrelated.
In your post-financialisation model, would you have a central bank?
Yes, I think so.
Would it set interest rates?
I think it would, and I've got some recommendations in here as to how you would massively increase the democratic accountability of the Bank of England, right?
But whether you or not you directly elect the people on the Monetary Policy Committee, or whether or not you make them more representative in terms of gender and ethnicity, or indeed more representative in terms of a spectrum of different views about how the economy should be managed, you're still basically talking about a group of technocrats fixing the price of something. Are you going to retain that model?
I mean, if you want money, you have to have a central bank.
No, you don't.
You do, unless you want to go back to commodity money, right?
No, on the contrary, you can have currency competition today with all kinds of currency.
Unless you want a Bitcoin or a Libra or And this is what's fascinating, because then you're just handing over the same amount of power, but rather than to a public technocrat, to a private oligarch.
But
the only way of doing this is to have an institution that's democratically controlled.
But would you therefore outlaw money that wasn't? Are you suggesting that in future, as non-state currencies become important, if the Facebook dollar came into circulation, or the Tesco credit, would you, and this is going to happen, and it's going to happen, I think, relatively soon, perhaps not those companies, but you will start getting private currencies, you already do to some extent. Digital will allow people to do transactions in Swiss francs, for example. Are you going to ban that?
The only way that any of this works is if, collectively, the world is able to take on the power of monopoly capital. If we get to a situation in which Facebook, Google, Amazon become so powerful that their currencies are trusted more than the US dollar and the British sterling, we're already far beyond that point. And I would argue we're already living in a dystopia. We've got a tiny number of Mark Zuckerbergs and Elon Musks effectively controlling all of our data, controlling our currencies, controlling, determining whether or not they pay tax, completely outside of the orbit of any democratic accountability. And obviously those firms themselves, again, are completely undemocratic.
But going back to your post-financialisation model, you would retain the essential model of a group of people. They may be more democratically accountable, you might elect them, but you would retain the same model of a small group of people fixing the price of credit. And in order to tackle monopoly capitalism, you would inhibit the creation of alternative capital systems, alternative private currencies.
The best model for a functioning and fair economy is to have credit that is cheap and relatively difficult to get, depending on who you are.
Isn't that a contradiction in terms, if it's cheap?
No, because it's a combination of relatively low interest rates and credit controls.
Okay.
So that was the other part of the system that was broken down in the 1970s.
So you want to go back to that?
Well, we stopped limiting the creation of credit quantitatively, right? And so today you have, a combination of relatively low interest rates and completely free credit. And obviously the credit goes to the people who are most credit worthy, which effectively means that the wealthy are able to get
hedge fund managers
cheaper credit than anyone else in society. Whereas, often the poorest face ridiculously high interest rates, even though they are technically able to get as much credit as possible. What we need is credit that is, is as a public good. Money is a public good, right? And because it is a public good, it needs to be democratically controlled, and there need to be mechanisms to ensure that those who are making these decisions are accountable.
I would argue that in a properly functioning free market economy, one person's credit has to be someone else's deferred consumption. I would say since 1971, the problem is that all sorts of credit has been conjured out of thin air by banks, encouraged by central bankers in the state who wants cheap credit to borrow. And so you've got absolutely no correlation, no relationship between savings and credit. And that's the root cause of the problem. So if you want to nationalise the creation of credit, you're dealing with a system where credit creation has been nationalised.
Credit itself, I don't think is the problem. There is this argument, as you said, one person's credit is another person's deferred consumption. Actually, if you look at the way that would have been true before the system of fiat money that we have today, right? Definitely. But today, effectively, the reason that we are able to have fiat money is because we have states that are incredibly powerful. And those states are able to say that in 10, 20, 30 years, I will still exist.
When you make them more powerful,
and I will still be able to... Well, okay, powerful for who and, by who.
But you'll be making them more powerful. You may be acting in the interests, as you see it, of a broader section of society. But you're talking about conferring on the state even more power.
It depends how you view the state, right? So if you see, the state as it is now, right, which is an undemocratic, unaccountable, effectively, as you said, kind of cabal of people that works as Marx said, a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. There is a way of having a state, which is an entity, obviously in Bavarian terms, that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, which is a state that is owned and run collectively in the interests of all, for the interests of all. And that, for me, is really the next phase of human development, right? Capitalism emerged. Capitalism has not always been the system according to which humanity has operated. Before
we were poor before then.
Exactly. Before that, you had feudalism. Before feudalism, you had, various other forms of...
But since capitalism, we've become a lot richer.
Yeah, because human society has progressed, right? We had
because of the free market.
Well, you had... Obviously, before capitalism, you had a system of social relations which led to technological and sociological change up to the point at which capitalism became viable. Capitalism became viable, it was institutionalized. It itself oversaw a process of technological and sociological change up into the point that we're at today, whereas it has become less and less effective at achieving the kind of aims that we would want it to be able to achieve. In the same way, that level of technological and sociological development that we see today is paving the way for a new form of social organisation, just as feudalism paved the way for capitalism.
Where would you say capitalism started?
Well, I mean, like any social system, it emerged in the cracks of the one that was then dying. So you saw, in various towns across, let's take England as an example, you saw various towns in different parts of England working on kind of mercantilist social relations. I suppose in Venice there was
the Dutch Republic.
Of city-states which had these kind of mercantilist relations. But really, I would say capitalism as a system proper, that is a political and economic system, and those two things aren't separable for me, really emerged in the UK during the Industrial Revolution.
Can you think of any society before England in the Industrial Revolution, or the Venetian Republic in the Middle Ages, or the Dutch Republic in the early modern period, any society before then, where there was an increase in per capita GDP before the English Industrial Revolution or the Dutch Industrial Revolution or Venice?
Where there was ever a per capita increase in GDP throughout the whole of human history? I have no idea. I mean, India, for example, prior to colonisation, had 25% of the world's GDP. I don't know what the growth rate was at the time. Another example.
Under the Mughals and the Ming, both India and China had just above subsistence levels of per capita. And Abbasid Iraq in the 10th century, Song China for a brief period when they decentralized control. But the point I'm trying to make is that I would argue that until you get free market capitalism, the human condition, the default human condition is grinding poverty.
Oh, of course.
There are half a dozen societies where there is an exceptional period of growth, and that is because they're sort of proto-capitalist, if you like. And I would say capitalism's responsible for this huge elevation. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But again, the question is, does it stop there? I see, most of the course of human history as developing in stages, right? As human societies have become more complex, as we've advanced technologically, intellectually, as effectively we've had more brains surviving for longer, interacting with one another in different ways, new forms of possibility emerge. Financial capitalism is not really imaginable in the early stages of capitalism. Really, capitalism wasn't imaginable to anyone living in a feudal society, where, as a serf, your life was effectively determined by your relationship with the boss above you.
Even when Adam Smith's writing The Wealth of Nations, he had no idea that we were on the dawn of the Industrial Revolution.
What would be happening there. And even before you had the emergence of feudalism, you had all sorts of different societies which, in some ways, represented an improvement on what came before, but also had their own internal problems and contradictions. In some ways, of course, capitalism has represented an improvement on what came before. And it's definitely, as a political and economic system, so effectively state capitalism, the relationship between state and capital, has been responsible for amazing advancements in technology. But as those advancements have happened, the possibilities for how we organise ourselves have changed. And today, I think we are living in a phase of human history where the possibilities for people to organise themselves are bigger than we've ever seen them before. You've got amazing levels of technology that allow, corporations to know what you want before you even got it. But the revolutionary potential of those technologies are concentrated in the hands of this small elite.
You can do collectivism without a small vanguard of comrades organising it for you.
Yes, you can. You can do real collectivism today, I would argue, because you've got these amazing technologies that allow us to coordinate our activity in ways that we've never really been able to before. It facilitates not just production, but also the workings of democracy.
Do you think that previously capitalism has relied on the pricing mechanism to allocate resources, and perhaps with the use of data, it'll be so good that you could actually have an economy where you use data to allocate resources even more efficiently than the pricing mechanism?
Well, this is a very interesting argument, because the Austrian economists would obviously say no. Because,
would they?
Well, I mean, the Hayek would say the price mechanism is governed by an incredibly complex system that is impossible to kind of recreate. It's a similar argument to what you get in neuroscience about consciousness.
But I think Hayek would probably say that you can't have a small group of people with enough knowledge. But he lived in a world that was analog. Perhaps, some of the artificial intelligence that some of these tech capitalist monopolies create might actually be so good that you can actually allocate resources using data.
I mean, we're speculating here, but for me, there is a strain in Hayekian thinking that views the workings of the price mechanism as effectively unknowable. And this is, I think, an interesting debate also that comes into complexity theory and complexity economics. Is it impossible to plan the economy because we don't have enough information? Or is it impossible to plan the economy because the economy is effectively unknowable? You have a similar sort of thing with, as I said, the human brain. Is it possible to recreate consciousness if you just rewired a brain entirely? Or is that something else entirely? And I think Hayek was actually in the unknowable camp. That's obviously speculation, I don't know. I actually think, I would say, it has historically been very difficult to plan the economy because we haven't had that level of information. Whereas actually, the amount of data, the amount of kind of technology we have today means that we will be much better able to coordinate production, allocation and consumption in a way that would be efficient. But again, not just focusing on efficiency, which is obviously important, but also thinking about how we solve the biggest existential crisis that humanity's ever faced, climate change, as well as solving all of these other problems that we need to deal with, like, productivity, inequality, etc.
We've just seen Trump rather ludicrously offering to buy Greenland. And my first thought is, does he know something about climate change we don't know?
I highly doubt that.
But does he think it's so bad that Greenland might become, a breadbasket in a few years' time?
I honestly don't know. I feel like this is just Trump being like, oh, I see the opportunity for a deal, I'm going to go and do it. But
what was so odd is when the Danish Prime Minister, I thought rather sensibly said, do you know what, it's our sovereign territory, no.
And that made me think,
but then
why
his
is Greenland still a Danish territory?
But then actually they were in the EU, but then left. But we won't go there. Actually, we will as a country go there, but that's for another story. Changing tack slightly, inequality. I'm interested. What do you think in your book? Do you think inequality's got worse, and what do you think the nature of inequality is in Britain today?
So, if you look at the trends on income inequality, for example, what you see is that it spikes dramatically in the 1980s, levels off with a few kind of ups and downs until 2007. Takes a little dip in 2007, obviously, because the wealthy lose so much. And again, levels off after that. But has now started to rise.
I'm going to show. I'll show a couple of graphs actually on this piece because I think it's a really interesting story. It definitely does rise in the 80s, but the story certainly since the beginning of the millennium is a bit more complicated.
Yes, it is actually complicated. It's complicated for a number of different reasons. So you have that Gini coefficient, basically kind of flattening, now starting to rise again.
Doesn't it actually show that income inequality has fallen since the year 2000?
It definitely did fall in 2007. I'm not sure for how much longer after, but effectively flattened after that and is rising again. I think our Gini is something like 0.36, and I think it's been around that for a while now. What that trend doesn't show, of course, is the fact that the top 1% have increased their share of income substantially.
But they're paying a lot more tax now, the top 1%.
Well, except a lot of them aren't, because they're finding ingenious ways to shift that money all around the world.
I think I'm right in saying well over half of income tax is now paid by the top 4%?
Yes,
5%?
So, and partly because of that massive concentration in income, obviously, the richer are paying more. That isn't necessarily a kind of model that you would want to see. You don't want income inequality to be so high.
If it's up to me, I would have flat taxes, but we're talking about your book, not mine.
The result, the reason that we've got obviously a small number of people paying a lot of taxes because income inequality has risen a lot, and that share that the top 1% have got has increased really very dramatically, and there are reasons. Would you increase
income tax on those people?
On the top 1%, absolutely.
But surely it was the cut in income tax under George Osborne that's linked to them paying an even higher tax bill.
So there is this idea that there's some sort of graph, a Laffer curve for income tax, and that if you reduce income taxes above a certain level, then you'll increase revenues. Of course, the only reason that's true is twofold. It's because the wealthy are able to avoid tax and because they're able to move their money all around the world. I would argue that we need a massive clampdown on tax avoidance and evasion. It is simply ridiculous.
Would you introduce capital controls?
And I would reintroduce qualitative capital controls, yeah.
How would you
I would introduce taxes on inflows and outflows, like a financial transactions tax, but for currency, which would increase the effectiveness of income taxes. But also the other thing that I want to talk about when it comes to inequality, which is wealth taxes, because wealth inequality is doubly as high as income inequality.
When you say wealth, you talk about assets.
Yes, so whether that's ownership of financial assets like equities, ownership of land, property, those sorts of things, and that is extremely unequal in the UK, particularly financial wealth. That's got a Gini of something like 0.9, which is astronomical. And the issue with that is that the ownership of wealth isn't just about means. It's not just about your capacity to kind of support yourself. It confers power. And again, those tiny number of people that own all the equities, that own all the shares in all these companies, they are controlling a lot of the priorities of these corporations.
I certainly agree. One of the consequences of what I would call Osborne economics, this is the bailouts, quantitative easing, cheap credit for banks, it's pushed up the value of assets. So if you own a house, you've done really well. I looked at some data actually before this interview. In North London, there's a couple of districts in North London where if you have been an average person going out every day since 1979, earning an average income, and also owned an average house there, you would have earned more money from the bricks and mortar appreciation. Crazy. But it's not just homeowners who've done well. If you own assets in the form of financial instruments, all these hedge fund managers we think of as financial geniuses, they're not. Actually, if you borrow at 2% and invest and get a 4-5% return, that's a lot of Porsches you can buy. It's a one-way bet at public expense.
Another big argument in the book is that the political economy that underpins finance-led growth is built on an alliance between the 1% and between the middle earners, basically, between what you might call middle classes. And in instituting this model, in allowing huge amounts of credit to be created and directed into the purchase of financial assets, the purchase of real estate, alongside financial globalization, you obviously see massive asset price inflation combined with the creation of huge amounts of instability. That enriches the top 1% far more than it enriches anyone else, but it also provides some capital gains for enough of the population to make them more stable.
I agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, I think it's a really important point when we're talking about inequality. I think it's only fair to acknowledge income inequality is not the real problem. It's asset price inequality that's the problem.
They're linked, but I would say that wealth inequality was more of a problem than income inequality.
You're talking about some of the answers. You democratic socialism, you advocate,
do.
We'll talk a little bit about the example of other countries that have tried this, not entirely successfully. We also talked about capital controls.
Yes.
I think that's certainly a bold move. Does this mean if you went on holiday to France, assuming that you're allowed to do so after Brexit, would you have to fill in a form saying, I've got no more than...
No, you would not. The way it would work, and I've done a report about this actually, is that it would effectively look like a financial transactions tax, but on currency.
Right.
All the infrastructure is already in place to be able to do this because you have centralised systems that monitor transactions that occur between different parties. And effectively what it would mean that would be above a certain level, say if you want to move more than, £10,000 out of the UK, then you would have to pay a progressive tax on the amount you wanted to move out. And that tax would be able to be increased or decreased depending on the point that we were at in the financial cycle. So if you started to get large capital inflows, you might want to put a tax on capital inflows because capital inflows have been a significant reason for the appreciation in London real estate, for example. If you saw lots of capital outflows, you might want to put a relatively high tax on outflows.
Foreigners investing in the UK is also one of the reasons why we have such a high living standard. I mean, think of all those factories and offices and businesses that aren't British in origin, but we do rather well because they've invested here.
The most important thing, I think, to understand about British political economy is the way that we relate to the rest of the world. And for a long time, our wealth has come from the accumulation of lots of wealth here during the Industrial Revolution, which was then invested in other parts of the world. And when you invest in other parts of the world, sure, it creates jobs there, but ultimately you are creating an asset which will yield a return that will come back into
dividends.
The UK. Exactly.
But there wasn't much left of that investment after 1918, was there?
After outward investment, exactly. And so for a long time, we had basically the accumulation of lots of assets all around the world that paid money into the UK. After the 1980s, that model shifted quite substantially. And you got the emergence of a big current account deficit, and you started to get capital flowing into the UK from people putting their investment into the UK.
We're the second largest recipient of inward investment. I think only China gets more inward investment than we do.
And so a significant problem for the UK is that we've got lots of capital flowing in from the rest of the world, but not into things that are productive. So I recently wrote a report on this actually, which fed into a lot of the research for this book, which looked at the nature of capital flows into the UK before the financial crisis. And what you saw was surplus that had been accumulated in places like Germany, various other parts of the world, being ploughed into UK financial and real estate markets. Effectively, we already had a bubble, we had rising asset prices, international investors wanted to get, wanted to take advantage of that. And what that did, those capital flows into UK assets didn't really create much in terms of rising productivity, exacerbated financial instability, drove up asset prices, as well as driving up the value of our currency. And what does driving up the value of the currency do? It means that exporters, manufacturers, particularly based outside of London and the regions, face a much higher exchange rate. which makes their exports less competitive. You get this self-reinforcing cycle of capital inflows driving up asset prices, people buy more imports, and exporters are unable to compete on international markets, massive current account deficit, and really quite substantial increases in instability.
Now, if you want to tackle this with a system of capital controls, presumably that precludes the possibility of us ever joining the euro. Is that right?
Well, yes, absolutely. And I think it would be a terrible idea for us to join the euro either way.
Do you think we should remain in the EU?
I've been outspoken on the fact that I don't think we should remain in the EU. No, partly because of this issue of...
You're very welcome on this show.
I was going to say, I thought that's why you invited me.
I'd rather be governed by a socialist who was elected by Brits that we could get rid of than by an unelected Euro banker.
Well, exactly. I think that's probably the main link between critique of the euro from the left and from the right.
Yeah, I mean, next to you is Yanis Varoufakis' book. I don't agree with his politics, but there's a lot of sense in what he says.
Yeah. I mean, whether or not you think from the right we've got this system of crony capitalism that's managed by Europe, or from the left you think that Europe works in the interests of a tiny number of corporations rather than being accountable to people, you've got the same critique, which is effectively insufficient accountability.
I remember listening to Tony Benn when I was at school, and he had a profound impact on me when I heard him talking about this, and he was very much a man of the left, but I remember thinking, I think he's onto something with this.
Absolutely. I think partly that has been why there has been such a backlash against Europe, is that it just seems so remote and unaccountable.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that there was this whole narrative in the aftermath of the vote to leave the European Union that a whole swathe of people had voted against their interest and didn't know what they were doing. If you look at the emergence of that model, right, of those capital inflows coming to the UK, boosting asset prices, leading to deindustrialisation, financial globalisation has been disastrous for the UK, and particularly for the parts of the UK that voted to leave the European Union. They were onto something. Sure, they might not have been able to say, yes, the problem we're facing is Dutch disease and capital inflows, but they will have known that their areas, their communities, their workplaces have been impoverished as integration has increased.
And the financial system we have definitely means that you get this, it subsidises the creation of tower blocks and bankers' bonuses in London, and you get this two-tier economy. You get the London economy and the trickle down into the southeast, and then you get everywhere else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like this is what you're starting to see as the world's become more financially integrated. You have a couple of massive urban centres that exist at this level of kind of international, really like a global elite that moves their money, that moves their assets between these different centres, whether it's London, Dubai, New York, etc. And these places exist in this ethereal world of the global economy, have more in common with one another often than they do with the rest of their countries as a whole. And it's created huge amounts of inequality, obviously, but it's also created political issues and resentments. Dubai is a fascinating example of this, because the way it gets around it, the way it gets around this problem is by saying only 10% of people can be citizens. The rest of US slave labour that builds the tower blocks that international investors put their money into.
Dubai has also got a financial business district in it under which the laws of England and Wales apply.
Right.
And it's contracted out its entire process of adjudication to the laws. It imports judges from Hong Kong, Singapore and the UK. And you see where it starts. You've got ordinary bit of Dubai and then tower block, and it's where the laws of England and Wales apply. But it's got an economy where it literally imports very, very cheap labour, treats them appallingly under many conditions, and
and that's the model that you ultimately get when you have this level of integration, because it creates. Economists are terrible at thinking about history and path dependency, which is that when you get a kind of agglomeration of capital, of skills, of resources in one area, that area attracts investment. It grows, it attracts more investment, and suddenly you get rising regional inequality, etc.
It sounds suspiciously like neoclassical endogenous growth theory, which I think was something that Ed Balls once became famous for talking about.
Not quite. But, God, don't get me started on endogenous growth theory. There's a role for history and for path dependency in economics, right? And whether you're looking at the concentration of power in international monopolies, in big cities, in big banks, it's just not something that most economists look at.
I read a book by Jesus Huerta de Soto, who's an economics professor at Madrid University, and it's extraordinary because he talks a little bit about the history. And you think that this process of what you call financialization is affecting the UK and has affected the UK economy. But of course, he talks about what happened in the Netherlands, the home of the world's first industrial revolution, the Bank of Amsterdam. You get hyper financialization. Look what happens there. It ends in disaster.
Yeah.
You could almost say you've got the similar thing in Venice. I mean, I would even go so far as to say, and I say this in a book I published quite recently, in the Republic of Rome, you, towards the late Republic, have a symbiotic relationship between the publicani, which are a bit like banks, the banks of their day, in that they're tax farmers. The Senate gives them permission to tax the provinces in return for paying ready cash now. So like with banks today in the bond market, the state gets money to spend today, the financial institution gets a slice of future tax revenue, and you get this huge sort of shift in invested interest, this symbiotic relationship. And it means by the end of the late Roman Republic, the Italian peninsula is not making anything. It's an economic husk.
This is fascinating. This is actually an argument by a kind of Marxist historian called Arrighi, who says that financialization is the late stage of capitalist development in empires all around the world. And he cites Venice, the Netherlands, the UK, and now America.
He's probably been reading Carswell's book, Progress versus Present. But what's really extraordinary is when the republics of Venice and the republics of the Dutch and the republics of the Romans, when those three republics end up with this massive influx of wealth, which means that the body politic of the republic gets sort of, the constitution gets subverted because of this massive inflow of wealth and this creation of this hyper-rich elite. It's by extorting provinces. The Dutch have provinces in the Far East, the Venetians have them in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Romans obviously have provinces around the Mediterranean. I would say the wealth today is being sucked in, not from any provinces, but from posterity. It's the bond market that allows this hyper-financialization, this transfer of wealth from an unborn generation to today's elite. And it's this that explains the creation of
I would say it's being sucked in from global south. The way that each of these empires ends up trying to solve this problem of hyper-financialization is through imperialism. You get the agglomeration of this amount of wealth in the centre. It needs an outlet.
But where is this wealth coming from?
Well, okay, so initially,
there's just not the wealth in Africa to exploit. It isn't there.
Initially, you get the agglomeration of this wealth in the place that is the most advanced, productive. Let's take the example of the UK, right? After the Industrial Revolution, you have let's say a lot of savings, a lot of wealth that needs to be invested. Where does it get invested? In other parts of the world. You have the same thing in the Netherlands. You have the same thing in Venice. When you invest that wealth in other parts of the world, you are then guaranteeing yourself a long-term return from those parts of the world.
But it's really fascinating.
Allows you to kind of continue to manifest that imperial relationship.
You're absolutely right in the chronology. You've got the economic takeoff of the Dutch, of the English with their industrial revolutions, and then the acquisition of empire. So often those on the left assume that it's the acquisition of empire that allows the creation of wealth.
The acquisition of empire is a mechanism for channeling domestic savings, domestic wealth, into capital accumulation.
Economic takeoff happens pre-imperialism.
Yes.
But then imperialism then comes along and corrupts the body politic that allows the free market.
What allows the model to continue. Because otherwise you have this problem of you have too much money stuck at the top. Where is this wealth going to go? Who is going to buy the goods that are being produced?
But where does it go? I mean,
imperialism is a solution to that because that wealth is invested abroad.
But however much wealth some Dutch merchants got from the spice trade with the Far East, however much wealth some Lancashire cotton millers got from selling cotton to India, it was nothing as the wealth that was being created in the Dutch Republic and in the UK as a consequence of specialisation and exchange.
And continued to be created in those countries, right? That wealth continued to be accumulated and it continued This is Marx's idea that capitalism needs a spatial fix. You get too much money that is stuck at the very top, accumulated by the people who own the capital, and they need to find an outlet for it. So it spreads its tentacles all over the world, finds up new avenues, whether it's going into China or resource extraction in Africa, which allows people to continue to make as much money from their money as they're used to making in their domestic environment. Now that then itself creates a whole load of problems, which, as you were saying, like you get underdevelopment in other parts of the core of that region. It also creates potentially unstable political dynamics.
Do you think British imperialism underdeveloped Africa?
Oh, absolutely. But the main reason for this...
British imperialism extended in Africa after 1880. Where was the capital investment after 1880 in Africa?
Where is the capital?
Where were the factories and the mines? There were very few.
I mean, it mainly went into resource extraction, right? If you look at the investment in Africa, investment in Africa in terms of extraction prior, in the early days.
But manufacturing output, including wealth from mining, was a minuscule amount of GDP in compared to the UK GDP.
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, you're starting from effectively an incredibly low base, right? If you imagine capitalist development as taking place through a stage of, you have effectively kind of subsistence forms of agriculture, you then have a state that is able to create a landless peasant class that goes to work in the factories, then manufacturing takes place, then that creates different forms of sociology. That process is disrupted in most parts of the world because rather than those relationships changing and coming, rather than getting kind of the emergence of domestic capitalist class and the emergence of secondary industry and manufacturing, etc., you get the wealth that is created from extraction and from subsistence farming coming out of those places, not going to domestic capitalists, going to capitalists in the core, and the returns from that model.
How do you square that with the fact that per capita GDP in countries like Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania increased in the first part of the 19th century? Then you get to independence and they decrease very dramatically in countries like Uganda. And it's only really quite recently, long after imperialism and colonialism and post-colonialism is a distant memory, that you start to get this growth.
So colonialism in terms of the investment that it creates obviously does expand GDP, right? But it does so in a way that prevents the natural development of that economic system in a way that would allow it to become self-sustaining. We've been waiting for almost a century for this alleged catch-up to take place, right? We've been told for a very, very long time that if the rest of the world just allows international investment, just allows British and American, effectively capitalists, to come in, buy up large swathes of their economy and build factories, etc., then those economies...
But isn't this happening?
That is not what has happened.
Isn't the greater...
The parts of the world that have developed over the last kind of 20, 30, 40 years are those that have had domestic and often state ownership of large part of the commanding heights of their economy.
Take China,
the South Asian tigers, etc.
China, the standout example.
Exactly.
China kicks out the external parasites in 1948. In 1948, the average Chinese was as poor as a Chinese person would have been 2,000 years earlier. Far from taking off, the next 20 or 30 years see China make a series of blunders with state-owned control of the economy, the Great Leap Forward, which ends up with millions of people starving. It's only after 1978 when, for example, state-owned enterprises are no longer run on the workers' collectivist model that you talk about, when you start to get proper free market capitalism. That's when you get the takeoff.
China, there is no way of describing China since the 1970s as proper free market capitalism.
It's a move towards it. It's an abandonment of socialism.
Capital controls, exchange controls, mass state ownership of not just corporations but finance, a credit system, a monetary system.
But in pre-78, state-owned enterprises are run from the centre. Post-78, state-owned enterprises are run at a provincial level, and it's possible for private capital, private ownership of those firms. You get this system of free market capital. There's no other way to describe it.
I couldn't disagree more that this is a free market capitalist system. I agree that you get decentralization, so that municipalities become much, much more important in the working of this model. But you still have mass state ownership, whether it's state ownership that's affecting the level of the
cameras that are recording it, that one and that one are, I think, a Japanese-owned firm that manufactured it in China. That one, and I forget the name, I'll flash it up on the screen, it's made by a company that's owned by China. Are you saying that they don't really own it? It's a state-run company that owns that company. It's a state-run company.
Is it a private company that
It's a private company.
Yeah, of course. I mean, because, you're right to say that there has been an expansion in private ownership, and particularly foreign ownership in China. But it's all controlled and mediated by the system of state allocation of credit, which is incredibly important. So all the banks really are state-owned. Of state ownership of the largest and most systemically important organisations, and of capital controls. Because still you have this model where China is effectively controlling the amount of capital that comes into and out of the Chinese state. It has not allowed the larger, most important parts of its economy to be bought up by foreign investors, and that's the reason that it's been able to develop.
Given the vast amount of credit and debt, I would say artificial credit and artificial debt, particularly at a municipal level in China, don't you think that actually their financialization problem, insofar as they've got one, is even worse than us?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the kind of the transition towards, I suppose, a slightly more mixed economy in which, yes, you still have basically state ownership of the most important things, combined with some private ownership and greater integration into the global economy, has created a set of very serious problems. The first problem was obviously China was hit very substantially by the financial crisis. What did the Chinese do in the aftermath of the financial crisis? They spent 20% of their GDP on a stimulus program designed to boost the economy again. And it worked incredibly well for a very, very long time. Really, for the 10 years after the financial crisis, it was Chinese state spending and the spending of state-owned enterprises and the municipalities that was keeping the global economy afloat. The issue that we've got to today is that the system of private credit creation, alongside a boom in particular asset markets, particularly property markets in some parts of China, has gone too far. And part of that is, of course, because the government doesn't want to stop that to allow growth rates to go below what they see as the politically acceptable level of around 5-6%.
Douglas, you've been incredibly generous with your time, and
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great fun.
I want to conclude by asking you for your thoughts about Jeremy Corbyn and the British political situation. Now, I take it you're not a Boris Johnson fan.
Absolutely not.
And you are a Jeremy Corbyn fan.
I am.
Tell me, what would you like to see? I'm not going to rebut any of this because you know it's people aren't interested in what I think. They want to know what you think. If Jeremy Corbyn is party leader, gets in, there's an election soon, and he becomes prime minister, what would you like him to do straight away? What would be your idea of correcting all these problems?
Amazing. You've asked me to tell you about my ideas from the book. So firstly, we need... my argument is effectively, as I said, that a lot of what happens in the economy is not just determined by abstract economics, it's determined by power relations. And so the centre of my argument is that a socialist government has to take on the banks the way that Thatcher took on the unions. You need to rebalance power relations if you want to change the way things work. So I think we need a massive increase and change in the way that the private banking system is regulated. As I said, we need controls on the amount of credit that's able to be created. We need to think about limiting the amount of capital that goes into certain sections of the economy, real estate, for example, and replace that private banking system with a public banking system that is democratically run, accountable, and directs credit into socially useful activities. That helps to finance.
Who would decide what was socially useful?
The democratic process.
Okay.
We collectively come together and engage, whether that's, so there's one model, for example, that sees public banks as having a board that is comprised of a majority of directly elected representatives, along with, say, representatives from government, from unions, from business, and community.
Maybe a citizens' assembly?
Well, I mean, quite, that sort of model. And over the long term, you would use that to finance a Green New Deal, which would effectively see our economy go to zero carbon, hopefully, by 2030. And also create a kind of development bank that would be able to finance those transitions in the rest of the world as well. Alongside the big idea in my book, which I argue for, which I'm not sure how you're going to feel about, the creation of a people's asset manager. So at the moment, big asset managers agglomerate all our savings and use it to buy up big chunks of the economy. BlackRock owns all these businesses. And
George Osborne's employer.
So rather than having us send our pensions to BlackRock and BlackRock use them for its own ends, extracting fees in the process, why don't we have a democratically owned and run people's asset
Would
manager?
our pensions have to go to it?
Our pensions would not have to go to it. There would be incentives, and there would be tax incentives, and also, I suppose, democratic incentives, because you'd be able to engage in this asset manager in a way that you can't engage in BlackRock.
So it would be entirely voluntary.
You
could hand it to the pensions commissar, but you don't have to.
So I think that there should be a fund in there to manage pensions, and there should be a fund in there to manage the collective assets that we already have as a state, whether that's the Crown estate, parts of.
And would this disperse power?
Yes, I would, because it would buy up strategically assets in the economy that we would consider, based on the democratic objectives laid out in the Green New Deal, to be public goods. And so you would steadily increase collective democratic ownership over various different parts of the economy, as well as increasing investment in those areas that need it most.
Quick question. You said up till now socialism hasn't worked because it always concentrates power.
Yeah.
And you said that this is democratic socialism. But I still fail to see how creating these new institutions and giving them all this power, how that's going to be any different to what's already been tried.
Because they're institutions that are run by the people,
So was the government of the German Democratic Republic. So was the government of Venezuela.
Well, again, all of these places, they end up, because you have economic power concentrated in this, with this tiny elite, with 4 or 5 people often, that government ends up being accountable to those people rather than to people that elect it, right? We need mechanisms to strengthen democratic accountability.
Isn't the market a form of democracy? Isn't the market a great form of democracy? If anyone can invest their pension pot wherever they like.
The market is a form of democracy that works very well for all the people that already have the wealth, right? So it is a form of democracy that works on the principle of $1, 1 vote, rather than 1 person, 1 vote. That is not the kind of democracy that I would like to see, and it's not, I would argue, the kind of democracy that will allow us to solve some of the world's biggest problems.
There's more to eat today in London than there is in Venezuela.
Of course, right? And Venezuela is suffering from a whole host of various interrelated issues to do with the falling price of oil, sanctions, along with a kind of crony state socialist regime that is not working. For
the wrong kind of socialism.
Well, there's no democracy. It's absolutely not a democratic socialist model, is it?
Well, didn't they elect and use referenda?
Yeah, there are democratic mechanisms, but there are democratic mechanisms in almost every country all over the world, right? It's a question of how strong they are and whether or not they influence what the powerful actually end up being able to do.
So you've got capital controls, you've got the people's asset manager. Having worked in asset management, I think it's an intriguing idea. I'm not sure you would get that many people voluntarily putting their pensions in, but see what those tax breaks are like. Capitalists can be very pragmatic when it comes to tax breaks. What else would you do? Export controls, import controls?
I think the capital controls get to that problem because obviously, the current account deficit is a mirror of the financial account. So.
Would you nationalise land if people own too much of it?
My proposals for housing are a couple. I have a couple of different proposals. So firstly, you're obviously limiting credit creation particularly for kind of buy-to-let landlords, people who already own homes, etc. Mass social house building programme as part of the Green New Deal. So you'd be retrofitting existing houses, you'd be building homes to a very high environmental standard, and particularly focused in regions of the country that have been underdeveloped. And also a programme of remunicipalisation. So if, for example, you get, after Brexit, for example, we might see a slight decline in house prices. You might then see people wanting to sell their houses. Historically, the government has kind of stepped away and allowed that process to happen. But we know that we are missing a huge amount of social housing in this economy, and that land.
So you would buy up private houses.
Allow the state and local authorities.
I can see lots of crony capitalists who are going to love your democratic socialist model. If you're going to offer to buy houses should the house price market go down, in other words, if the state is going to underwrite house prices, don't you see what's going to happen?
Well, you would put a limit under the ability of house prices to fall below a certain level, right?
It becomes a one-way bet.
You would have the state offer, obviously, to step in and buy that house at a level below the market value for a whole host of reasons, because you wouldn't have to go through a long and complicated process, because it would be much more secure. But over the long term, that asset is then owned by the state, and it generates revenues for the state in the form of social rents. And house prices ultimately tend to increase.
So you would underwrite house prices and say that the state would step in and buy houses if the value of the house fell.
The idea would be to effectively keep house prices the same, right? So the combination of the controls on credit and the building social housing and remunicipalisation would aim to keep house prices level, allow them to be eroded by inflation over the long term, as well as providing decommodified housing for those who can't currently afford it, so that over the long term you get them falling relative to incomes.
Okay. Grace, it's been absolutely fascinating having you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've agreed with some of what you said. I've not agreed with some of what you said, but my views are immaterial. Thank you very much for coming on. And when is the book out?
It's on the 10th of September.
Fantastic. I'm going to put a little strip along the bottom so people can click on. And I hope, even if the viewers don't naturally agree with everything you said, I think it'd be well worth people reading, because I think it raises points that free marketeers should at least understand and address, even if they don't agree with them. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks.